Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the True Scary Stories compilation. Story 1. The Frosted Grip. The night had always been my sanctuary. A time where silence draped itself over the world like a comforting blanket. But recently, my nights had turned into a theater of horror. It began subtly, a creak here, a whisper there. At first, I dismissed these as figments of an overactive imagination. My old house, a colonial relic passed down through generations, seemed the perfect breeding ground for such flights of fancy. I was wrong. It was a particularly frigid night when the incident occurred. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes even the warmth of a thick blanket seem futile. I lay in my bed, cocooned in layers, drifting between the edges of consciousness and dreams. That's when I felt it, a cold hand grasping mine. It was an icy, bone-chilling grip that sent shivers racing down my spine. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, its cold seeping through my skin, freezing my very blood. My eyes flew open, but the darkness of the room was unbroken. I yanked my hand back, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I fumbled for the light switch on my nightstand, and when the soft glow filled the room, there was no one there. I stared at my hand in the dim light. Frostbite. The tips of my fingers were white, the skin taut and numb. Who's there? My voice trembled, echoing through the emptiness. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaky, and inspected the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but a pervasive chill hung in the air, more penetrating than the winter outside. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, the fireplace crackling feebly. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. Dawn couldn't come fast enough, and when it did, I called Dr. Harris, the town's physician, to examine my hand. Dr. Harris looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism as he unwrapped the layers of bandages. "You say this happened in your sleep?" His tone suggested he was waiting for the punchline of a joke. "Yes," I replied, wincing as he probed the frostbitten skin. I felt a hand grasp mine. It was so cold. "Are you sure you didn't sleepwalk and touch something frozen?" His voice was gentle, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "I know what I felt, doctor," I insisted, my voice firmer than I felt. "There was something, in my room." He nodded slowly, more to placate me than out of agreement. "I'll prescribe something for the pain. Keep it wrapped and avoid exposing it to cold temperatures." I thanked him and left, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. What had happened to me was beyond natural explanation, and I had no idea where to turn. As the days passed, the frostbite slowly healed, but the memory of that icy grip haunted my every step. Each night, I dreaded the moment I'd have to close my eyes, fearing what might happen if I did. It was then that I began to notice other things. Little things, at first. Objects slightly out of place, faint footprints in the dust. And then, the whispers. They were soft at first, barely audible over the rustle of leaves or the hum of the refrigerator. But soon, they became unmistakable, a hissing chorus that echoed in the stillness of the house. I had to find out what was happening. I couldn't live in this constant state of fear. So, armed with a resolve born from desperation, I began to delve into the history of my home, seeking answers to the mystery that enveloped me like a shroud. Hey! Subscribe for more scary stories. Days turned into weeks as I scoured every nook and cranny of the old house, looking for any clues that could explain the terrifying occurrences. I pored over family records, old photographs, and forgotten letters. The whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent, as if urging me to uncover a long-buried secret. One evening, while rummaging through the attic, I found a weathered trunk hidden beneath a pile of dusty blankets. It was locked, but determination and a bit of force pried it open. Inside were items that seemed out of place in our family history: old, ornate clothing, a faded journal, and a small silver locket. The journal, its pages yellowed with age, belonged to a woman named Eliza Montgomery, a name unfamiliar to me. As I read her entries, a story of love, betrayal, and sorrow unfolded. Eliza had lived in the house over a century ago. She wrote of a passionate affair with a man named Thomas, who promised her the world. But Thomas betrayed her, marrying another woman for wealth and status. Eliza's heartbreak turned to fury, and she detailed a chilling vow of vengeance in her final entry: "If I cannot have his heart, no one shall find peace in this house. My spirit will linger, a cold hand in the dark, until justice is done." The words sent a shiver down my spine, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Eliza's spirit was still here, trapped in a cycle of rage and sorrow. I took the journal to the town library, hoping to find more about Eliza and Thomas. The librarian, Mrs. Crane, was a font of knowledge about the town's history. When I mentioned Eliza's name, she paled slightly, but quickly composed herself. "Eliza Montgomery's story is a tragic one," she said, her voice hushed. "She was found dead in her room, frozen to death on a warm summer night. They say her spirit never left. How do I help her find peace?" I asked, desperate for any solution. Mrs. Crane hesitated. "Some believe that confronting the spirit and acknowledging her pain can release her. But be careful. Spirits tied to vengeance are unpredictable." That night, I returned home with a plan. I would try to communicate with Eliza, to show her that her story was known and her pain acknowledged. I set up candles around my room, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Holding the journal tightly, I called out to her. "Eliza, I know your story. I know your pain. Please, show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted, my breath forming clouds in the air. The candles flickered wildly, and the whispers grew to a crescendo. "He betrayed me," a voice hissed, the words echoing through the room. "Eliza, you don't have to suffer anymore," I pleaded. "Thomas is long gone. You deserve peace." A cold breeze swept through the room, and for an instant, I saw her, a translucent figure of a young woman, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Peace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, peace," I repeated, stepping closer. "You can rest now. Your story has been told." Her figure shimmered, the icy grip on my heart loosening. She seemed to smile, and then she was gone. The room warmed instantly, the oppressive chill lifting as if a great weight had been removed. I thought it was over. I truly believed I had helped her move on. But that night, as I slept, I felt it again, the cold hand grasping mine. I woke with a start, my hand once again covered in frostbite, the whispers louder than ever before. The terror that gripped me upon awakening to another frostbitten hand was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Eliza's spirit had not moved on. Instead, her presence seemed stronger, more malevolent. I had underestimated the depth of her sorrow and rage. It was clear that uncovering her story wasn't enough. Something else was binding her to this house, something darker and more sinister. I couldn't face this alone. My thoughts turned to my old friend and paranormal investigator, Michael. We had drifted apart over the years, but his expertise in dealing with the supernatural was my last hope. I reached out to him, explaining my situation. To my relief, he agreed to help and promised to visit the following weekend. When Michael arrived, his demeanor was serious, a stark contrast to his usual easygoing nature. "This sounds like a classic case of a vengeful spirit," he said after I had recounted everything. "But it's unusual for a spirit to cause physical harm like frostbite. We need to understand what's truly anchoring her here." We spent the next few days setting up equipment around the house, thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and motion detectors. Michael conducted a thorough investigation, and on the third night, we gathered in the living room to review the findings. The recordings were chilling. Disembodied voices filled the tapes, some of them pleading, others filled with rage. One phrase, however, stood out: "Find the locket." "The locket?" I asked, puzzled. "You mean the one I found in the trunk?" Michael nodded. "It must be significant. spirits often attach themselves to personal items. It's possible that the locket holds the key to understanding her torment. We retrieved the locket and carefully examined it. It was a delicate piece, intricately engraved with the initials EM. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young man, Thomas, I assumed. But there was something else, a small, folded piece of paper hidden behind the portrait. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. The note was brief but filled with despair. To Eliza, my eternal love. Forgive me. This changes everything, Michael said quietly. Thomas did love her. But something, or someone, forced him to marry another. I felt a surge of empathy for Eliza. She had died believing she was betrayed, her spirit bound by that belief. But who had manipulated their lives so cruelly? The answer came to me suddenly: Thomas's family. They had been powerful and ruthless, known for their cold, calculating nature. Michael, we need to confront her again, I said, determination hardening my voice. She needs to know the truth. We returned to my room, the locket and note in hand. I called out to Eliza once more. Eliza, I have something to show you. It's from Thomas. The temperature dropped sharply, the now familiar chill enveloping the room. Her ghostly figure appeared, eyes wide with a mix of hope and anger. Thomas. He loved you, Eliza, I said, holding out the locket. He was forced to marry another. Look at the note he left you. Her ghostly hand reached out, touching the locket. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, her presence becoming almost tangible. She read the note, her expression shifting from anger to sorrow, then to a profound sadness. I never knew. I'm sorry for your pain, I said gently. But you can be free now. You can move on. Her form shimmered, and for a moment, I thought we had succeeded. But then, the room grew colder than ever before, and a new voice, dark and menacing, filled the air. You think you can free her so easily? Michael and I froze, the new presence exuding pure malice. It wasn't just Eliza. Something much darker was here, something that had kept her bound in torment for over a century. The sinister voice reverberated through the room, filling every corner with a palpable sense of dread. Michael and I stood frozen, the weight of an unseen presence bearing down on us. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe with malevolent intent. Who are you? I demanded, my voice quivering. What do you want? The voice laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. I am the guardian of her pain. The keeper of her despair. You cannot banish what you do not understand. Michael stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. We're not afraid of you, he said, his voice steady. Eliza deserves peace, and we will give it to her. The room seemed to darken, the shadows closing in. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the walls. Fools, the voice hissed. Her suffering is eternal. As long as I exist, she will never find peace. I felt a surge of defiance. You're the one who forced Thomas to betray her, aren't you? I accused. You manipulated their lives for your own gain. The voice laughed again, a chilling sound. Yes, and I have enjoyed every moment of their torment. Eliza's pain feeds me, keeps me strong. I gripped the locket tightly, drawing strength from its presence. Not anymore, I said, my voice firm. We will end this. We will free her. Michael and I joined hands, standing strong against the encroaching darkness. I focused on Eliza's sorrow, her love for Thomas, and the betrayal that had bound her spirit. I called out to her, pouring all my empathy into my words. Eliza, you don't have to suffer anymore. We know the truth now. You were loved. You were always loved. This creature has lied to you. You can let go. Eliza's ghostly form appeared, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I don't know how, she whispered, her voice trembling. Trust us, Michael said softly. Let us help you. The dark presence roared, a sound filled with fury and desperation. No! She is mine. Ignoring the voice, I held out the locket. "This is your truth, Eliza. Hold on to it. Remember the love you shared with Thomas. It's stronger than any hatred." Eliza reached out, her ghostly fingers brushing against the locket. The room seemed to hold its breath as she took it into her hand. The air around her shimmered, the frost melting away. Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of peace in her eyes. The dark presence shrieked, a sound of pure rage and anguish. "You cannot take her from me." Michael and I stood our ground, our voices united. "She is free now. You have no power here." With a final, ear-splitting scream, the darkness began to dissipate, the oppressive chill lifting. The shadows retreated, and the room warmed. Eliza's form grew brighter, her expression serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. As her spirit faded, I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. The oppressive presence was gone, and the house seemed lighter, almost welcoming. I turned to Michael, who gave me a weary but triumphant smile. "It's over," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. I nodded, my heart swelling with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. "Yes, it's finally over." But as we started to leave the room, a chilling realization struck me. The frostbite on my hand hadn't faded. I stared at it, a sense of unease creeping back into my mind. And then, from the depths of the house, I heard it, a faint whisper, cold and menacing. "You may have freed her, but you are still mine." The horror wasn't over. It had just begun. Story 2. The Whispers Within. The first time I heard the scratching, it was past midnight. I was lying in bed, struggling to sleep, when a faint, persistent noise caught my attention. It came from the wall behind my bed, a rhythmic, almost deliberate scratching. I dismissed it as the creaking of the old house, but a sense of unease settled in my chest. The next night, the scratching returned, more insistent and closer. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, straining to catch every sound. It stopped abruptly when I shifted my weight. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the noise itself. I laughed nervously, chiding myself for being spooked by something so trivial. Days turned into weeks, and the scratching grew more frequent. It seemed to follow me from room to room. Sometimes, it was behind the kitchen cabinets, other times behind the living room walls. It was as if something was trapped inside, desperate to escape. I shared my experience with my friend Tom over coffee, hoping for a rational explanation. "Probably just rats," Tom said dismissively, sipping his coffee. "Old houses like yours are perfect for them. You should call an exterminator." I wanted to believe him, but something about the scratching felt too deliberate. It was as if whatever was making the noise was aware of my presence, reacting to my movements. One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and frustration, I decided to knock back. The scratching stopped immediately, and my heart leaped into my throat. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, I heard it. A faint whispering, so soft I could barely make out the words. It sounded like a woman, her voice filled with desperation and fear. "Help me," she said, the words stretching into an eerie echo. I stumbled back, feeling a chill run down my spine. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the woman's voice replaying in my mind. Who was she? Why was she trapped in my walls? The questions swirled in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a rodent problem. Something far more sinister was at play. Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching the history of my house. It was built in the early 1900s and had changed hands many times. I found old newspaper articles about the previous owners, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, I stumbled upon a story from the 1970s about a woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Emily, and she was last seen near my neighborhood. There were rumors that she had been having an affair and that her lover had been a resident of my house. Could it be Emily's voice I was hearing? The idea seemed preposterous, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the scratching and whispers were connected to her. As days passed, the whispers grew more frequent, more desperate. I began to hear them even when there was no scratching, always the same plea, "Help me." Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate further. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I started prying open the walls in the places where the sounds were most frequent. My heart raced with each creak and groan of the old house, but I was determined to find out what, or who, was inside my walls. With each nail I pried loose, my anxiety grew. What was I hoping to find? Bones? A hidden room? Part of me was terrified of the answer, but I had come too far to turn back now. The first section of drywall gave way, revealing a dark void. I shone the flashlight into the space, my breath catching in my throat. It was empty. I moved to another spot where the scratching had been particularly intense, near the kitchen. As I tore away the wall, a musty smell wafted out, making me cough. I illuminated the space, expecting more darkness. Instead, I saw something glinting, a small, rusted locket. My hand trembled as I reached in and retrieved it. It was old, the clasp barely functional. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman. Emily. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, the locket before me, the whispers began again. This time, they were louder, more coherent. "Find me," the voice pleaded. "I'm here." I felt a shiver run through me. Emily was trying to communicate, but from where? I glanced at the open wall, the darkness within it seeming to pulse with hidden secrets. The next day, I contacted Tom again, hoping he might help me. "Tom, you have to come over," I urged. "There's something you need to see." Reluctantly, he agreed. When he arrived, I showed him the locket and the photograph. He stared at it, a frown creasing his brow. "This is weird," he admitted. "But it doesn't prove anything. Maybe someone just hid it there." "Then explain the scratching and the whispers," I challenged. Tom had no answer. We decided to dig deeper, literally. We spent hours tearing down more sections of the walls, revealing nothing but cobwebs and dust. Frustration gnawed at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was close, just beyond my reach. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the scratching again, more frantic than ever. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The whispers followed, clearer and more insistent. "Below," they said. "Below." It dawned on me that we had been looking in the wrong place. Emily wasn't in the walls, she was beneath the house. The basement had always given me the creeps. It was damp and cluttered, filled with old furniture and forgotten junk. Tom and I descended the creaky stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with mildew and something else, something metallic. In the far corner, hidden behind stacks of boxes, was a trapdoor I had never noticed before. My heart raced as I approached it. "Tom, help me with this," I whispered. Together, we moved the boxes aside and pried open the trapdoor. A gust of cold air hit us, and I shivered despite myself. The narrow, rickety stairs led down into a pitch-black void. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. With the flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, I descended into the darkness. The space below was cramped and cold. The walls were rough stone, damp with moisture. As I scanned the room with the flashlight, the beam landed on something that made my blood run cold, a set of manacles bolted to the wall, and within them, skeletal remains. Tom gasped behind me. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's her." My mind reeled. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, echoing off the stone walls. "Help me," they cried. "Free me." I approached the skeleton, a sense of sorrow and horror washing over me. Emily had been trapped here, forgotten, her pleas for help unanswered for decades. But as I reached out to touch the manacles, the whispers changed, turning into a low, guttural growl. The growl reverberated through the small, cold chamber, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. Tom and I exchanged a terrified glance, the realization dawning that we were no longer alone in this dark, forgotten place. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance menacingly on the stone walls. The growl grew louder, more menacing, echoing from the very walls themselves. "We need to get out of here," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the sinister sounds. But as we turned to leave, the trapdoor slammed shut above us with a deafening bang. I dropped the flashlight in shock, and it rolled away, casting an eerie, spinning light. We were plunged into almost complete darkness, the only illumination coming from the dim, shifting beam of the flashlight as it settled in the corner. "Tom, help me!" I shouted, my voice trembling. We rushed to the trapdoor, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Something, or someone, was holding it shut from the other side. Panic surged through me as the growling turned into a cacophony of whispers, overlapping and disjointed, surrounding us in a symphony of terror. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my ankle. I screamed, kicking out instinctively. Tom swung the crowbar, hitting the air where my attacker should have been, but there was nothing there. The whispers seemed to laugh, mocking our helplessness. "You can't leave," they taunted. "You're ours now." Desperation clawed at me as I tried to think of a way out. "Emily!" I called out, my voice breaking. "Please, help us. Tell us what to do." For a moment, the whispers paused, and I heard her voice again, faint but clear. "Release me," she whispered. "Free my soul." I realized she was talking about the manacles. With trembling hands, I moved back to the skeleton and began working on the rusty chains. Tom joined me, and together we pried them open. As the last shackle fell to the ground, a chilling wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the flashlight's beam. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I felt Tom's hand gripping my arm tightly, both of us too scared to move. Then, a soft, ethereal glow began to emanate from the skeleton, growing brighter and warmer until it filled the room with a gentle light. Emily's form appeared before us, a shimmering, translucent figure, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she said, her voice like a soft melody. "You've set me free." Her smile was bittersweet as she began to fade. But as she disappeared, the growling returned, more furious than ever. The chamber shook, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. "What the hell is happening?" Tom yelled, trying to keep his balance. The whispers turned into screams, a chaotic chorus of rage and pain. The ground beneath us trembled as if something monstrous was trying to break through. The glow that Emily left behind began to coalesce into a dark, swirling mass. It pulsated with a malevolent energy, the very air around it crackling with tension. "Run!" I shouted, yanking Tom toward the stairs. We scrambled up, the dark mass following us, its whispers now a deafening roar. Reaching the trapdoor, we pushed with all our might. It gave way, and we burst into the basement, slamming the door shut behind us. We could still hear the growling and scratching from below, but it was muffled, contained. For now. We raced upstairs and out of the house, collapsing on the front lawn, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Tom panted, his face pale with fear. I shook my head, unable to form coherent words. Emily was free, but something far darker had been awakened. As we sat there, trying to comprehend what had happened, I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever we had unleashed was still down there, waiting. And it wouldn't stay contained for long. In the days following our harrowing encounter, Tom and I avoided the house as much as possible. I moved in with him temporarily, unable to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. Despite the distance, the events in the basement haunted my dreams. The whispers and growls reverberated in my mind, and I could feel the dark presence, lurking, waiting. Tom tried to distract us with normal activities, but nothing could dispel the creeping terror. One evening, as we sat silently watching TV, the screen flickered, and the power went out. "Just a blackout," Tom said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Moments later, our phones buzzed simultaneously with a text from an unknown number, "Come back. Finish it." We exchanged a look of sheer terror. "We have to go back," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not over. Emily's freed spirit awakened something far worse. If we don't deal with it, it will find a way out." Armed with flashlights, salt, and an old book on exorcisms Tom had hastily bought online, we returned to the house. The atmosphere was thick with foreboding as we stepped inside. The air was colder, and a faint, foul smell permeated the rooms. The house groaned, as if aware of our presence. We made our way to the basement. Each step felt heavier, the whispers starting again, growing louder as we descended. The trapdoor lay in the corner, ominously silent. We opened it, peering into the darkness below. "Ready?" Tom asked, gripping my shoulder. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. As we stepped into the underground chamber, the oppressive atmosphere nearly knocked us over. The dark mass from before was there, swirling and pulsating, its whispers now a deafening cacophony. The book in Tom's hand began to tremble, almost as if alive. We sprinkled the salt in a circle around us, a protective barrier. "Start reading," I urged Tom. He opened the book, his voice shaky but determined as he began to recite the incantation. The dark mass recoiled, screeching in rage. The chamber shook violently, stones and debris raining down on us. The whispers intensified, voices of torment and anger merging into a single, malevolent entity. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, the voice echoing in the confined space. "I am eternal." Tom's voice grew stronger, more confident, as he continued the incantation. The dark mass writhed, shrinking and expanding, as if caught in a battle with the words of the exorcism. I felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. The entity lashed out, shattering the salt barrier and knocking us to the ground. Desperation clawed at me as I watched Tom struggle to his feet, the book still clutched in his hands. The dark mass moved toward him, and in a split-second decision, I grabbed the locket we had found earlier and held it up. "Emily, help us!" I cried out, my voice echoing in the chamber. A brilliant light burst from the locket, blinding and pure. Emily's form emerged from it, radiant and strong. "You must finish it," she said, her voice commanding yet compassionate. She moved towards the dark mass, her light piercing through its malevolence. With a final, guttural roar, the dark entity began to dissipate, its form unraveling in the face of Emily's light. Tom continued the incantation, his voice unwavering. The ground beneath us shook one last time before falling still. The darkness evaporated, leaving only silence and the faint glow of Emily's presence. "Thank you," she said softly, her form beginning to fade. "You have freed us both." With those final words, she vanished, leaving behind an eerie calm. Tom and I stood in the silence, trying to process what had just happened. "Is it over?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. The house was silent, the oppressive weight lifted, but I knew that we would never truly be free from the memories. We emerged from the basement, the first light of dawn filtering through the windows. The house, once a place of terror, now felt like a hollow shell. As we stepped outside, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows on the ground. But even as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something watched us from the shadows, waiting for another chance to emerge. The whispers may have been silenced, but their memory would haunt us forever. Story 3. Whispering Fog. I had always loved the fog. It blanketed the world in a soft, ethereal haze, transforming the ordinary into something mysterious and unknown. But that changed one fateful evening, when the fog outside my window became something far more sinister. It started as a typical autumn night. The air was crisp, and the fog rolled in thick, cloaking the town in a ghostly shroud. I was sitting in my study, nursing a glass of whiskey and trying to lose myself in a book. The fog pressed against the window, swirling in hypnotic patterns. As I glanced up, my heart skipped a beat. Words were forming in the mist, coalescing into a message that sent a chill down my spine. "Let me in." I stared, transfixed, as the words hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. I shook my head, convinced it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But then I heard it, a voice, soft and pleading, matching the message in the fog. It was a voice I knew all too well, one that I hadn't heard in years. It was the voice of my deceased spouse, Emily. "Let me in," the voice repeated, clear and unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what I was experiencing. Emily had been gone for 5 years, taken from me in a tragic accident. The grief had nearly consumed me, but I had managed to rebuild my life, piece by painful piece. Now, hearing her voice again, I felt the old wounds tearing open. I stood and approached the window, my hands trembling. "Emily?" I whispered, my breath fogging up the glass. There was no response, just the swirling mist and the echo of her voice in my mind. I turned away, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But the fog continued to press against the window, insistent and unrelenting. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The voice had been so real, so vivid. Could it have been a dream? A hallucination brought on by too much whiskey and too little sleep? I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than that, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I awoke to find the fog had lifted, but the sense of unease lingered. I went about my day in a daze, the memory of Emily's voice haunting my every thought. As night fell, the fog returned, thicker than ever. I sat in the living room, watching it swirl outside the window, half expecting the message to reappear. And it did. "Let me in," the words formed again, more clearly this time. The voice followed, more insistent, more desperate. "Please, let me in." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was no trick of the light, no figment of my imagination. Emily's voice was real, and it was coming from the fog. I paced the room, my mind racing. What could it mean? Was Emily trapped somewhere, trying to reach out to me? Or was this something darker, something that wore her voice like a mask? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to find out. Summoning all my courage, I opened the front door and stepped out into the night. The fog enveloped me, cold and clammy against my skin. I strained to see through the thick haze, calling out into the darkness. "Emily? Are you there?" My voice sounded small and uncertain, swallowed by the fog. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, out of the mist, came the reply. "I'm here," Emily's voice echoed, closer now. "Please, let me in." The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, disorienting me. I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint its source, but the fog was too thick, too oppressive. Panic set in as I realized how lost I was. The familiar landscape of my front yard had vanished, replaced by an endless sea of white. I stumbled forward, desperate to find my way back. But no matter which direction I turned, the voice followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in. Please, let me in." Finally, I broke through the fog, finding myself back at the front door. I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was eerily silent, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Emily's voice had fallen silent, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. Hey! Subscribe for more scary stories. For days, I was tormented by Emily's voice. Each night, the fog rolled in thicker, the messages in the mist growing more desperate and insistent. "Let me in," it pleaded, a ghostly refrain that echoed in my mind. My once peaceful home had become a place of dread, the fog a constant, malevolent presence. I tried to ignore it, to go about my daily routine, but it was impossible. Emily's voice haunted me, a reminder of a past I couldn't escape. I barely slept, my dreams filled with fog and whispers. During the day, I felt her presence everywhere, as if she was watching me from the shadows. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit the old house we had lived in before her death. It had been abandoned since the accident, left to decay and rot. The memories of our time there were bittersweet, a mix of happiness and sorrow. I hoped that returning might offer some clue, some way to understand what was happening. The house stood at the edge of town, shrouded in fog. As I approached, the familiar sense of unease washed over me. The windows were broken, the once vibrant garden overgrown with weeds. I pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. I wandered through the empty rooms, memories flooding back with every step. Our laughter, our arguments, the love we had shared, all seemed to echo in the silence. I felt her presence more strongly here, as if she was just out of sight, watching me. I made my way to the attic, the place where we had stored all our keepsakes and mementos. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and forgotten treasures. I rummaged through the boxes, looking for anything that might explain the voice in the fog. At the bottom of one box, I found an old journal, Emily's journal. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages yellowed with age. The entries were a window into her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams. I read through them, my heart aching with each word. Near the end, I found an entry that caught my eye. It was dated just days before the accident. Emily had written about strange dreams, of a voice calling to her from the fog. She had felt a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just beyond her vision. As I read, a sense of dread settled over me. Emily had known about the fog, had felt its pull even before her death. I continued reading, the final entry sending a chill down my spine. I hear it every night now, she had written. The voice in the fog. It wants me to let it in. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. Emily had been haunted by the same voice, the same fog. Had it played a part in her death? The thought was too terrible to contemplate. I knew then that I had to confront the fog, to find out what it wanted and put an end to its torment. That night, I returned home, my resolve steeled. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I stood in the living room, staring out into the swirling mist. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice returned, more insistent than ever. "Let me in," it pleaded. "Please, let me in." The fog swirled, forming words again. "Help me." "Help you?" I repeated, bewildered. "How? What do you need?" The reply was immediate, the voice filled with desperation. "Find me. Bring me back." The fog pressed closer, the words almost tangible. "I need you." I realized then that the fog wasn't just a manifestation of Emily's spirit. It was something more, something darker, using her voice to manipulate me. But why? What did it want? The questions swirled in my mind, as thick and impenetrable as the fog itself. I knew I had to find out. Taking a deep breath, I opened the front door and stepped out into the night, the fog swallowing me whole. The voice guided me, leading me deeper into the mist, away from the safety of my home. "Let me in," it whispered. "Help me." I followed the voice, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog grew thicker, the world around me fading into nothingness. I felt a presence, dark and oppressive, closing in on me. I knew I was close, but to what, I couldn't say. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Bring me back. Let me in." And then, through the fog, I saw it, a faint, flickering light, beckoning me forward. The flickering light grew brighter as I stumbled through the fog, my heart pounding in my chest. The oppressive darkness pressed in around me, the voice guiding me forward. "Let me in. Help me," it repeated, an urgent whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, but I pressed on, driven by a desperate need for answers. As I neared the light, I realized it was coming from a lantern, hanging from the branch of a twisted, gnarled tree. The tree stood alone in a clearing, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Beneath it, partially hidden by the fog, was an old well. The stones were worn and covered in moss, the opening dark and foreboding. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in. Find me." It seemed to emanate from the well, a chilling echo that reverberated through the clearing. I approached the edge, peering into the darkness. The air was thick with a sense of dread, as if the well itself was a gateway to something unspeakable. "Emily?" I called, my voice trembling. "Are you down there?" There was no response, just the cold, unyielding silence of the well. The lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was not alone. The fog swirled around me, forming shapes and figures that seemed to dance in the periphery of my vision. Summoning all my courage, I lowered a rope into the well, securing it to the tree. The voice grew louder, almost frantic. "Let me in. Please, help me." I knew I had to go down, to face whatever lay hidden in the depths. Taking a deep breath, I grasped the rope and began my descent. The air grew colder as I descended, the darkness closing in around me. The walls of the well were slick with moisture, the stones rough against my hands. The voice guided me, urging me onward. "You're close. Don't stop." My heart pounded in my chest, each step taking me deeper into the unknown. Finally, I reached the bottom. The air was damp and musty, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The well was deeper than I had imagined, a cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever. The voice was louder now, echoing off the walls. "Help me. Let me in." I moved cautiously, the beam of the flashlight revealing an old, rusted door set into the stone. The door was covered in strange symbols, etched into the metal. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shock through my system. I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do settling over me. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, the sound echoing through the chamber. Beyond the door was a small room, the air thick with an oppressive presence. In the center of the room, illuminated by the flashlight, was a mirror. The mirror was old and ornate, the glass cracked and clouded with age. As I approached, the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Let me in. Please, help me." I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the glass. The reflection was distorted, a twisted version of reality. Suddenly, the mirror began to glow, the light blindingly bright. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes. The voice grew louder, almost a scream. "Let me in. Help me." The glow intensified, filling the room with an otherworldly light. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. I lowered my hands, blinking against the darkness. The mirror was gone, replaced by a figure that looked exactly like Emily. She stood there, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and fragile. "You freed me." Tears filled my eyes as I reached out to her. "Emily? Is it really you?" She nodded, a sad smile on her lips. "Yes, it's me. But we don't have much time." The fog, it was never just the fog. It was something darker, something that wanted to trap us both. My heart ached as I looked at her, the love of my life standing before me. "What do I do?" "You have to destroy the source," she said, her voice trembling. "The lantern. It's the key. Destroy it, and the fog will lose its power." I nodded, determination flooding through me. "I'll do it. I promise." Emily reached out, her hand cold against mine. "Be careful. It's stronger than you think." I climbed back up the rope, the sense of urgency driving me forward. The fog was thicker now, the presence more oppressive. I approached the lantern, the light flickering ominously. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed it and smashed it against the ground. The lantern shattered, the light extinguishing in an instant. The fog recoiled, the oppressive presence lifting. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, the air growing lighter. Emily's voice echoed in my mind, a final whisper of gratitude. "Thank you." As the fog dissipated, I knew that Emily was finally at peace. But as I turned to leave, I saw a shadow in the corner of my eye, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. In the days that followed, I thought the nightmare was finally over. The fog had lifted, the oppressive presence gone. I could feel Emily's gratitude, her spirit at peace. But the shadow that lingered in the corner of my eye haunted me, a constant reminder that something still wasn't right. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the sun set over the horizon. The world seemed normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the sky darkened, the fog began to roll in once more, thick and ominous. My heart sank as I saw the familiar words form in the mist, "Let me in." "No," I whispered, backing away from the window. "This can't be happening again." The voice returned, more desperate than before. "Let me in. Please, let me in." It was Emily's voice, but twisted, filled with anguish and pain. I knew it wasn't her, not really. Whatever had haunted us was still out there, and it was getting stronger. Desperate for answers, I returned to the old house, determined to find the source of the darkness. The fog followed me, swirling around my feet as I made my way inside. The air was thick with decay, the house an eerie echo of its former self. I climbed the stairs to the attic, hoping to find some clue I had missed before. In the corner of the attic, where I had found Emily's journal, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A trapdoor, hidden beneath a pile of old boxes. My hands trembled as I cleared away the debris, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. With a deep breath, I descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, stone chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to those I had seen on the door in the well. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it, a book bound in dark leather. The book seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the air around it thick with power. I opened the book, the pages filled with incomprehensible symbols and drawings. But one page caught my eye, a detailed illustration of the lantern I had destroyed, and beneath it, a passage written in an ancient script. As I read the words, a cold realization washed over me. The lantern had been a conduit, but not the source. The true source of the darkness was the book itself. I knew what I had to do. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed the book and rushed back up the stairs. The fog pressed in around me, the voice growing louder, more frantic. "Let me in. Please, let me in." I ignored it, my focus solely on the task at hand. Back in the attic, I threw the book into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The air crackled with energy, the symbols on the walls glowing brightly before fading to darkness. The fog outside the window dissipated, the voice falling silent. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of finality settling over me. I returned home, exhausted but relieved. The house was quiet, the oppressive presence gone. I knew that Emily was truly at peace now, and that whatever darkness had haunted us was finally vanquished. I sat by the window, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon, a new day beginning. But as the morning sun cast its light over the room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall, faint but unmistakable, were the words "Let me in," etched into the plaster. The shadow in the corner of my eye grew darker, more defined. I realized then that the darkness was never truly gone. It was a part of me now, a lingering presence that would always be there, waiting. And as the fog began to roll in once more, I knew that my battle was far from over. Story 4. Watchful Eyes. It began on a dreary Saturday afternoon. Rain pattered incessantly against the windows, casting a rhythmic, hypnotic spell over the house. I had decided to tackle a long-ignored task, cleaning out the attic. Armed with a flashlight and a trash bag, I ascended the creaky wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The attic was a forgotten place, a dusty repository of memories and relics long past their prime. As I rummaged through boxes of old clothes, faded photographs, and tarnished trinkets, a sense of nostalgia washed over me. Then, in the farthest corner, hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket, I found it. A doll, its porcelain face cracked in places, stared up at me with unblinking glass eyes. It wore a tattered lace dress, yellowed with age, and its hair, once likely a lustrous blonde, was now a tangled mess. Despite its decrepit state, there was something unnervingly lifelike about it. I picked up the doll, feeling a chill run down my spine as I did. "Who put you here?" I murmured, as if expecting an answer. There was no response, of course, just the silence of the attic and the constant drumming of the rain. I decided to bring the doll downstairs, intending to clean it up and perhaps keep it as a curious antique. That night, I placed the doll on a shelf in the living room and went to bed, feeling an odd mix of unease and amusement. My sleep was restless, filled with vague, unsettling dreams of those unblinking eyes. When I woke the next morning, I found the doll had moved. It was now sitting on the coffee table, facing the couch where I had fallen asleep watching TV. "How did you get there?" I asked aloud, the sound of my voice echoing unnaturally in the empty room. I picked up the doll and returned it to the shelf, dismissing the incident as my own forgetfulness. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few days, the doll continued to move. Each time, it was in a different room, always positioned to face me. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I was moving it in my sleep, or maybe it was a prank by a friend. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went, cold and unblinking, as if it was trying to tell me something. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I returned home to find the doll sitting in my bedroom, on my nightstand, its eyes fixed on my bed. My heart raced as I picked it up, its porcelain skin cool and smooth under my fingers. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of my empty house. The final straw came a week later. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound, a soft, shuffling noise coming from the hallway. I sat up, straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, fear paralyzing me. Slowly, the door creaked open, and there it was, the doll, its glass eyes glittering in the dim light, staring directly at me. I screamed, grabbing the doll and throwing it against the wall. It shattered into pieces, 1,000 shards of porcelain scattering across the floor. Breathing heavily, I turned on the light, staring at the remains of the doll. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. From the corner of the room, a soft whisper reached my ears, barely audible but unmistakable. "You can't get rid of me." In the days that followed, I was haunted by the remnants of the shattered doll. I had swept up the pieces and disposed of them, but the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. It seemed as though the doll's spirit lingered, taunting me with its ethereal voice. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by restless nights filled with anxiety and dread. One evening, as I sat on the edge of my bed, exhausted and fraught with nerves, I decided to investigate the history of the house. The house had stood for over a century, a relic of another time. Perhaps the doll was a relic too, a remnant of a past resident. I went to the local library, poring over old records and archives, searching for any clue that might explain the doll's presence. I discovered that the house had once belonged to a family named the Whitmores. They had lived there in the late 1800s. Among the records, I found an old photograph of the family. And it was a little girl holding the very same doll, her expression solemn and hauntingly familiar. Her name was Emily, and according to the records, she had died under mysterious circumstances at the age of 10. As I delved deeper into the history, I learned that Emily's parents had been accused of neglect and abuse. The whispers around town at the time suggested that Emily's death had not been an accident. My heart ached for the little girl, trapped in a tragic past. But why was her doll haunting me now? What did it want? That night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Help me," they pleaded, the voice fragile and childlike. It echoed through the room, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, clutching the blankets to my chest, my eyes darting around the room. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. A cold breeze swept through the room, despite the windows being closed. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. "Find me." I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. Emily's spirit was reaching out to me, seeking resolution. I had to find out what had happened to her, and perhaps, in doing so, lay her restless soul to rest. The next day, I returned to the attic, determined to uncover any hidden secrets. I searched through every box, every corner, hoping to find something that might explain Emily's fate. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I found a small, locked chest hidden beneath a loose floorboard. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Inside the chest were letters, old and yellowed with age, written in a delicate, childlike script. They were from Emily, addressed to no one in particular, detailing the horrors she had endured at the hands of her parents. My heart broke as I read her words, her fear and pain palpable in every line. The final letter ended abruptly, as if she had been interrupted. It was dated the day she died. As I held the letters, the room grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw her, a ghostly figure of a little girl, her eyes filled with sorrow. She pointed to the floor, where a faint outline of a trapdoor was visible beneath the dust. My pulse quickened as I realized what she was showing me. With trembling hands, I opened the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I knew I had to go down, to uncover whatever lay hidden below. Emily's spirit hovered nearby, urging me on. I took a deep breath and descended into the unknown, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase led to a small, dimly lit room that smelled of damp earth and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. The room was bare except for a small bed in the corner, an old wooden chair, and chains fixed to the wall. My heart sank as I realized what this place was, a prison for a helpless child. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. In the center of the room, there was a single, unmarked grave, its dirt slightly disturbed as if recently dug. The whispers began again, louder and more urgent. "Find me," Emily's voice implored. My hands shook as I picked up a nearby shovel, the metal scraping against the ground, and began to dig. With each shovelful of dirt, the air grew colder and the whispers more frantic. Finally, the shovel struck something solid. I dropped to my knees and brushed the remaining dirt away, revealing a small wooden box. I pried it open, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a collection of items, a lock of hair, a worn teddy bear, and a locket. The locket bore a portrait of Emily, confirming that this was indeed her final resting place. As I held the locket, the whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence. Emily's ghost appeared again, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and ethereal. The air grew warmer, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. But the moment was fleeting. The atmosphere shifted, growing darker and more oppressive. A deep, malevolent presence filled the room, making it hard to breathe. A guttural voice echoed through the chamber. "You should have left well enough alone." The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing thicker and more menacing. I stumbled back, clutching the locket to my chest. The presence grew stronger, suffocating in its intensity. "She was mine," the voice hissed, filled with rage and malice. I realized then that Emily's tormentor was still here, a dark spirit bound to this place. Panic set in as I searched for an escape, my flashlight flickering wildly. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching out with clawed hands. I could feel the spirit's anger, a palpable force pressing down on me. "Leave her alone," I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls. The malevolent spirit roared in response, a sound that shook the very foundation of the house. I could see Emily's ghost, her form flickering, struggling against the dark presence. I had to do something, but what? My mind raced, grasping for any solution. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the letters. I pulled them from my pocket and began to read them aloud, my voice trembling. Emily's words filled the room, a testament to her suffering and innocence. The dark spirit recoiled, its power waning with each word. Emily's ghost grew stronger, her form solidifying as the spirit weakened. With the final letter, the dark presence let out a final, furious wail before dissipating into nothingness. The room grew still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Emily's ghost smiled at me, her eyes filled with a bittersweet gratitude. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. She began to fade, her spirit finally at peace. I climbed back up the narrow staircase, my legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. As I emerged into the attic, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The house seemed brighter, warmer, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. I knew that Emily was free, her spirit no longer bound to this place. But as I made my way back downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The house was silent, but the shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, the after effects of a harrowing ordeal. Then, as I reached the living room, I saw it. The doll, completely intact, sitting on the coffee table, its unblinking eyes staring directly at me. The sight of the doll sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I had destroyed it, shattered it into pieces. Yet, here it was, whole and intact, its glass eyes unblinking and accusatory. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to run. I reached out with trembling hands, lifting the doll. It felt cold, almost alive in its stillness. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. I placed the doll back on the table and stepped back, watching it warily. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the lights flickered. A dark shadow materialized behind the doll, taking shape into a tall, menacing figure. It was the dark spirit, more powerful and angry than before. "You meddled in things you don't understand," it hissed, its voice echoing with fury. "Emily was mine, and you took her away from me." The realization hit me like a blow. The doll was a vessel, a conduit for the dark spirit's power. Destroying it had only temporarily weakened it. Now, it was back, and it wanted revenge. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice shaking. "She's at peace now. You can't hurt her anymore." The spirit laughed, a chilling sound that reverberated through the room. "You think you've won? This is far from over." The shadows grew darker, creeping across the floor and walls, enveloping the room in an oppressive gloom. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for a way to fight back. My eyes fell on the locket, the one I had found in the hidden room. It still hung around my neck, a symbol of Emily's presence. I grabbed it, feeling a surge of warmth and strength. "You can't have her," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I won't let you." The spirit recoiled, its form flickering as the locket glowed with an inner light. Emily's spirit appeared beside me, her presence a beacon of hope. "You have to destroy the doll," she whispered, her voice urgent. "It's the source of his power." I nodded, determination flooding through me. With a surge of strength, I grabbed the doll and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames roared to life, consuming the porcelain and lace. The spirit screamed, a sound of pure agony, as its power was severed. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Emily's spirit turned to me, her expression one of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm free now." She began to fade, her form dissolving into a soft glow. "Live your life. Be happy." With those final words, she disappeared, leaving behind a sense of peace and closure. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The house was quiet, the malevolent presence gone. The doll was nothing more than ashes, and the dark spirit was vanquished. Emily was finally at peace, and I could feel her gratitude lingering in the air. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. The whispers were gone, replaced by a comforting silence. I found myself smiling more, the terror of the past weeks slowly fading into memory. I knew that I had done the right thing, helping Emily find peace. But sometimes, late at night, I would feel a chill, a fleeting sensation of being watched. I would tell myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of a traumatic experience. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was never truly gone. The shadows seemed to move just a little too much, and the air felt just a bit too cold. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a familiar sound, the soft, shuffling noise I had heard so many nights before. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to face the doorway. There, on the nightstand, was another doll, identical to the first, its unblinking eyes staring directly at me. Story 5. Unexpected Whispers. The day I moved into my new home, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. It was a charming old Victorian house nestled at the edge of a small, quiet town. After years of city life, I was looking forward to the tranquility and the chance to write my novel in peace. The house had a certain character to it, with its creaky wooden floors and intricate moldings. It felt like the perfect place to start anew. As I unpacked my belongings, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity, as if the house had been waiting for me. I brushed off the feeling as nerves and focused on settling in. The first night was calm, the silence of the countryside a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the peaceful surroundings. The next few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time exploring the house and the surrounding woods, enjoying the solitude. It wasn't until the third night that things began to take a strange turn. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when I heard a faint humming sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was a melody, soft, sweet, and eerily familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the tune. It was my favorite childhood lullaby, the one my mother used to sing to me every night. I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water. The humming seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I turned off the faucet and listened intently, but the melody faded away. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the pipes or some kind of auditory illusion. I finished the dishes and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The memory of the lullaby played over and over in my mind. The following day, I decided to investigate. I checked the basement and the attic for any signs of old speakers or hidden devices, but found nothing. The house was old, and the walls were thick, making it impossible to determine where the sound had originated. Frustrated, I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on my writing. But every evening, as darkness fell, the humming would start again, faint at first, then growing louder, always the same haunting lullaby. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I followed the sound. It led me to a small, seldom-used room at the back of the house. The room was empty except for a large, antique wardrobe. The humming was louder here, almost as if someone were inside the walls. I approached the wardrobe, my heart pounding. I hesitated, then threw open the doors. It was empty, but the humming stopped abruptly, as if I had interrupted something. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety. The humming seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent. I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up whenever I entered certain rooms. I decided to contact the previous owner, hoping they might have some explanation for the strange occurrences. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in the house for over 50 years, answered my call. She was kind but seemed hesitant to talk about the house. When I mentioned the humming, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You're not the first to hear it," she finally said. "My husband used to hear it too, but I never did. He said it was the voice of our daughter, Emily, who died when she was just a baby." Chills ran down my spine. I hadn't known about the tragedy. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice trembling. "He believed she was still with us, that she was trying to communicate. After he passed away, the humming stopped, and I never heard it again. Until now, it seems." That night, the humming started earlier than usual, echoing through the empty halls. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Determined to find the source, I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the small room with the wardrobe. As I stood in the doorway, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. I steeled myself and stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the room. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the walls. Hey! Subscribe for more scary stories. The humming grew louder as I stood in the small room, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My breaths were shallow, the melody wrapping around me like a cold embrace. It was the same lullaby, sweet yet haunting, and it felt as though it was calling me. I approached the wall, running my hand over the old wallpaper. There had to be something hidden behind it, something that explained the eerie sound. I decided to tear away a section of the wallpaper, revealing the bare wood beneath. My heart pounded as I found a small, concealed door embedded in the wall. The door was no larger than a cupboard, and it had a rusty latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. With trembling fingers, I unlatched it and pulled the door open. Inside was a cramped, dark space, barely large enough for a child to fit. The humming stopped abruptly as if it had been cut off. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, revealing a small, dusty room. It was empty except for a few old toys and a faded photograph of a young girl. I picked up the photograph, my hands shaking. The girl in the picture was smiling, her eyes filled with innocence. Written on the back was a name, Emily. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This must have been Emily's hiding place, her secret sanctuary. But why was her presence still so strong here? I felt a wave of sorrow for the little girl who had lived and died in this house. As I placed the photograph back, I noticed something glinting in the corner of the room. It was a small music box, intricately designed with delicate carvings. I picked it up and opened the lid. The same lullaby began to play, the notes tinkling softly in the still air. The music box must have been the source of the humming, but how was it playing by itself? I closed the lid, and the music stopped. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. If the music box was responsible for the humming, then why did I still feel like I wasn't alone? The air in the room grew colder, and I sensed a presence behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, in the doorway, stood the shadowy figure of a little girl. Her eyes were dark, her expression blank. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, but I felt a wave of sadness emanating from her. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure pointed to the music box, and I realized she was trying to communicate. I opened the lid again, and the lullaby started to play. The figure seemed to relax, her eyes softening. She moved closer, and I could see her more clearly. She looked exactly like the girl in the photograph, her face pale and ghostly. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small space. "I'm so lonely." Tears filled my eyes as I realized she had been trapped here, unable to move on. "How can I help you?" I asked, desperate to free her from her torment. "Find my mother," she said. "Tell her I love her." I nodded, my heart breaking for the lost child. "I will," I promised. "I will find her." The figure began to fade, her presence growing weaker. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing completely. The room felt empty and cold, but I knew what I had to do. I closed the music box and carefully placed it back in the hidden room. I sealed the small door and left the room, determined to keep my promise. The next day, I visited Mrs. Thompson and told her everything. She listened quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I always felt her presence, but I didn't know how to help her. You've given me a chance to say goodbye." That night, I felt a sense of peace in the house. The humming was gone, and the oppressive presence had lifted. I slept soundly for the first time since I moved in, feeling like I had finally made a difference. But as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft whisper in my ear, "You're not alone." Despite the newfound peace in the house, the whisper haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's message carried a deeper meaning, one I had yet to uncover. Days turned into weeks, and while the humming had ceased, other strange occurrences began to take its place. Objects moved on their own, and the temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly. I started hearing footsteps at odd hours, always just behind me, always disappearing when I turned around. One particularly cold night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I rushed downstairs to find the kitchen in disarray, pots and pans scattered across the floor, the cabinet doors flung open. My heart raced as I picked up the pieces, trying to rationalize the chaos. But as I bent down, I heard the faintest of whispers again, "You're not alone." Desperation led me to contact a local paranormal expert, Dr. Rebecca Hayes. She arrived with an air of calm authority, her eyes sharp and inquisitive. "Let's get to the bottom of this," she said, setting up her equipment around the house. She placed infrared cameras in the most active areas and used an EMF detector to trace any anomalies. As she worked, I felt a flicker of hope that she might find the source of the disturbances. That evening, Dr. Hayes and I reviewed the footage. The cameras had captured strange, shadowy figures flitting through the rooms, always just out of focus. The EMF readings spiked dramatically in the small room with the hidden door. "There's definitely something here," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "And it's not just Emily." Dr. Hayes suggested a seance to communicate with the spirits directly. As night fell, we gathered in the living room, surrounded by candles and protective symbols. She began to chant softly, calling out to the spirits. The air grew heavy, and a chill settled over the room. Suddenly, the candles flickered, and the temperature dropped further. A soft, plaintive voice echoed through the room. "Help me," it whispered, and I recognized it as Emily's. "There is another," she continued, her voice trembling. "It keeps me here." "Who are you?" Dr. Hayes asked, her tone firm and commanding. "What do you want?" A guttural, malevolent voice answered, "I want what was taken from me. I want revenge." The room shook, and the candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I shivered, my breath coming in short gasps. "What was taken from you?" Dr. Hayes demanded, but there was no response. The presence faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The seance had confirmed our worst fears. There was another spirit, one filled with anger and vengeance. Dr. Hayes explained that such entities were often bound by unresolved trauma or a violent past. "We need to find out who this spirit is and what happened to them," she said. "Only then can we hope to free Emily and bring peace to this house." I spent the next few days delving into the history of the house, scouring old records and newspaper archives. I discovered that in the late 1800s, the house had belonged to a man named Henry Blackwood. He was rumored to be a cruel and violent man, and his wife and daughter had mysteriously disappeared one winter. Neighbors had suspected foul play, but no bodies were ever found, and Henry himself vanished shortly after. With this new information, Dr. Hayes and I devised a plan to confront the spirit. We set up a circle of protection in the living room and placed items belonging to the Blackwood family in the center. As night fell, we began the ritual to summon Henry's spirit. The air grew thick with tension, and shadows seemed to dance in the flickering candlelight. "Henry Blackwood," Dr. Hayes called out, "we summon you to answer for your deeds. Release this house and its spirits." The temperature plummeted, and a dark, menacing figure materialized in the center of the circle. "You dare summon me?" it hissed, its eyes glowing with fury. "I will never release them. They are mine." Fear gripped me, but I stood my ground. "You can't keep them here," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "You have to let them go." Henry's spirit roared, the sound reverberating through the house. The candles flickered wildly, and I felt a rush of cold air. "You will pay for your insolence," he snarled, lunging at me. But as he crossed the circle, he was repelled by an invisible force, the protective symbols glowing brightly. "We need to weaken him," Dr. Hayes shouted over the din. "Focus on Emily. Call out to her." "Emily!" I cried, my voice desperate. "You have to fight him. You're stronger than he is. We can free you." The room shook violently, and Henry's spirit screamed in rage. But then, a soft light began to emanate from the small room upstairs, growing brighter and stronger. Emily's presence filled the house, her voice clear and determined. "I won't let you hurt them anymore," she said. "It's time for you to leave." Henry's spirit writhed, the shadows around him dissipating. With a final, furious scream, he vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. The house seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting. Dr. Hayes and I collapsed, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," she said, her voice weak but triumphant. "Emily is free." As I lay in bed that night, the house felt truly peaceful for the first time. But as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft, familiar whisper. "Thank you," Emily said. "But remember, you're not alone." The next morning, I woke up feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt since moving into the house. The sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on the wooden floors. For the first time, the house felt like a home rather than a haunted relic. Dr. Hayes had left early, confident that the worst was over. Emily's spirit, now freed from Henry's control, would find peace. However, as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I went about my day, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But every time I passed a mirror or caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window, I saw something dark and unsettling in my own eyes. The whisper from the night before echoed in my mind, "Remember, you're not alone." That evening, I decided to do one final sweep of the house, just to reassure myself. I started in the basement, checking every corner and crevice. Then I moved to the attic, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Finally, I returned to the small room where we had found Emily's hiding place. The air felt colder here, and the sense of being watched was stronger. As I stood in the room, I heard the faintest whisper of the lullaby again. My heart sank. How could this be happening? I thought we had freed her. I approached the hidden door and opened it, finding the small room just as we had left it. The music box lay undisturbed, its lid closed. I reached for it, my hand trembling. When I opened the music box, the lullaby played softly, and the temperature in the room dropped. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see Emily standing there, her expression sad but resolute. "Emily?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What's happening? I thought you were free." Emily shook her head. "It's not over," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "Henry was not the only one. There's another. Someone who never left." My blood ran cold. "Who? What do you mean?" She pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and writhe. "The house itself is haunted. There's a dark history here, long before Henry and I. The spirits are restless, and they won't leave until their stories are told." I felt a sense of dread settle over me. The entity wasn't just one malevolent spirit, it was a collection of lost souls, all tied to the house by their tragic pasts. "What do I need to do?" I asked, desperate for answers. "You must uncover their stories," Emily said. "Bring their truths to light, and only then will they find peace. But be careful. The darkness will try to stop you." Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in the history of the house, digging through old records, newspapers, and local legends. I discovered that the house had been the site of numerous tragedies over the centuries, unexplained deaths, mysterious disappearances, and violent incidents. Each story was more chilling than the last, and I began to understand the depth of the darkness that lingered within these walls. As I pieced together the history, the paranormal activity in the house intensified. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. I felt the presence of the spirits more acutely, their pain and anger seeping into my bones. But I pressed on, determined to help them find peace. One night, as I was poring over old documents in the study, the room grew icy cold. The candles flickered and then extinguished, plunging me into darkness. A chilling voice echoed through the room, "You should have left when you had the chance." I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I turned to see a shadowy figure looming over me. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" "I am the darkness," it hissed. I am the keeper of this house. You cannot banish me. You cannot save them. Summoning all my courage, I stood my ground. I won't let you keep them here. I will tell their stories. I will bring them peace. The figure snarled and lunged at me, but I held up the talisman Dr. Hayes had given me. The shadow recoiled, hissing in pain. You cannot stop me, it screamed. This house will always be mine. The confrontation left me shaken but more determined than ever. I spent the next several days writing the stories of the lost souls, detailing their lives and their tragic ends. As I wrote, I felt a sense of calm and purpose, as if I were finally doing something meaningful. On the final night, I gathered all the written stories and placed them in the small room behind the hidden door. I opened the music box one last time and let the lullaby play. The room filled with a soft light, and I saw the spirits of the lost souls, including Emily, standing before me. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given us peace." The spirits began to fade, their presence lifting from the house. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive darkness dissipated. For the first time, the house felt truly free. As I stood there, the lullaby still playing softly, I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. But as I turned to leave, I heard a final whisper, "Remember, you're not alone." Story 6. Haunting of Shattered Reflections. It all started on a rainy evening in late October. The house I had inherited from my estranged uncle loomed before me, shrouded in an eerie fog. A sense of dread washed over me as I approached the creaky front door. My uncle was a reclusive man, and rumors about his peculiar habits had circulated in the family for years. Still, I couldn't refuse the inheritance. The house was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life after a series of unfortunate events. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it unpacking, trying to make the old, dusty house feel like home. The furniture was outdated, and the air carried a musty scent that clung to my nostrils. As I settled into my new bedroom, I couldn't help but notice an ornate, antique mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. Its intricate frame was mesmerizing, yet something about it made me uneasy. In the days that followed, I began to notice small, unsettling changes. Objects weren't where I had left them, and strange noises echoed through the empty hallways at night. I tried to rationalize it, blaming my nerves and the age of the house. But the unease only grew stronger. It was the mirror that bothered me the most. Every time I passed by, I felt compelled to look into it, as if it held some dark secret waiting to be revealed. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of my reflection out of the corner of my eye. I froze. My reflection was smiling at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Its teeth were too sharp, and its eyes too dark. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by my own confused and frightened face. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to investigate the house's history. I found my uncle's old journals in the attic, buried under piles of dust-covered books. As I flipped through the pages, a chilling story began to unfold. My uncle had become obsessed with the mirror, convinced that it was a portal to another realm. He described seeing things in his reflection that shouldn't have been there, hearing voices that weren't his own. His final entries were frantic, filled with fear and paranoia. He believed the mirror was trying to consume him. One night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to cover the mirror with a sheet. As I approached it, my reflection once again smiled at me, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You're not alone in there," it whispered, the voice echoing in my mind. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and ran out of the room. I couldn't sleep that night, plagued by nightmares of being trapped in a world of darkness and sharp teeth. The next morning, I resolved to get rid of the mirror. I hauled it down to the basement, determined to lock it away forever. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft, mocking laugh behind me. The mirror had shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted image of my horrified face. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. Panic set in as I realized that whatever was in the mirror was now loose in the house. The shattered mirror pieces lay on the basement floor like a dark, glittering mosaic. I backed away slowly, my breath quickening. Every instinct told me to flee, but where would I go? This was my home now, whether I liked it or not. The presence I had felt in the mirror was now free, and it was in my house. I decided to call my friend Mark, a paranormal investigator, hoping he could make sense of what was happening. Mark arrived the next day, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a serious, concerned look. He brought with him an array of equipment, EMF detectors, digital voice recorders, and infrared cameras. As we set up, he listened to my recounting of the events with a furrowed brow. "It sounds like a classic haunting," he said, "but there's something more malevolent here. We need to be very careful." We started in the basement, where the mirror had shattered. Mark swept the room with his EMF detector, which immediately spiked. "There's definitely a presence here," he muttered. He set up a voice recorder and asked a series of questions, pausing after each one to listen for responses. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the recorder crackled to life. A faint, distorted voice whispered, "You can't hide." Mark's eyes widened, and he motioned for us to go back upstairs. We reviewed the footage from the infrared cameras and saw shadowy figures darting across the rooms, always just out of focus. "This entity is powerful," Mark said grimly. "It's feeding off your fear and the negative energy in the house." That night, I slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares of being chased through endless dark corridors by my own reflection. I awoke to a cold, oppressive presence in the room. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. I heard the soft, mocking laugh again, and then a whisper right by my ear, "You're not alone." I turned on the light, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Determined to fight back, I researched methods to cleanse the house. Mark suggested a ritual involving sage and salt, common tools in warding off evil spirits. We began in the basement, burning sage and spreading salt in a circle around the shattered mirror pieces. As we chanted protective incantations, the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The pieces of the mirror trembled, and a high-pitched, inhuman scream filled the air. I dropped the sage, my hands shaking. Just as we were about to give up, Mark's face lit up with realization. The mirror isn't the source, it's a conduit. We need to find the origin of the entity. We scoured the house, looking for anything that might be connected to the haunting. In my uncle's study, we found a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside was an old, leather-bound journal and a small, ornate box. The journal detailed my uncle's descent into madness as he became obsessed with contacting the other side. The box contained a small, cracked hand mirror, the twin of the one that had shattered. "This is it," Mark said. "This is the source. We need to destroy it." As we prepared to break the hand mirror, the temperature in the room plummeted. A dark figure materialized behind us, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You can't escape," it hissed. We both froze, the air thick with tension. The entity lunged at us, and I swung the hammer, smashing the mirror into pieces. The figure let out a piercing scream and dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. For a moment, everything was still. We had done it. Or so we thought. As we cleaned up the shattered remnants, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a shard. It smiled back at me, its teeth too sharp and its eyes too dark. The days following the destruction of the hand mirror were quiet, almost deceptively so. Mark and I convinced ourselves that we had finally rid the house of its malevolent presence. But the nagging feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something far more sinister wouldn't leave me. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. One evening, while I was sorting through my uncle's belongings in the study, I found another hidden compartment in his desk. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied together with a frayed piece of ribbon. They were addressed to someone named Evelyn, and as I read through them, a different picture of my uncle began to emerge. Evelyn was a medium, someone my uncle had contacted in desperation when his obsession with the mirror began to spiral out of control. In one of the letters, Evelyn wrote about a dark entity that she believed was trapped in the mirror. She warned my uncle that breaking the mirror wouldn't free him, it would only release the entity. She urged him to seek help from a higher authority, someone who specialized in exorcisms. It was clear my uncle had ignored her advice. The letters left me with more questions than answers. Why hadn't Evelyn's warnings worked? And what was this entity that seemed so bent on tormenting anyone who came into contact with the mirror? I decided to reach out to Evelyn, hoping she was still alive and could provide some much-needed insight. I tracked her down to a small town a few hours away. When I arrived at her modest home, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes answered the door. "You must be here about your uncle," she said, as if she had been expecting me. She invited me in and listened intently as I recounted the events of the past few weeks. "Evelyn, I think the entity is still in the house," I said, my voice trembling. "We thought we destroyed the source, but it's still here." Evelyn nodded gravely. "The entity you're dealing with is an ancient spirit, one that feeds on fear and despair. It was bound to the mirror, but when you broke it, you set it free. Now it roams the house, searching for a new vessel." "A new vessel?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "It wants to possess a living soul," Evelyn explained. "It's drawn to you because you are vulnerable, emotionally and spiritually." Determined to rid myself of this curse, I asked Evelyn for help. She agreed to perform a cleansing ritual, but warned that it would be dangerous. "The entity will fight back," she said. "You must be prepared for anything." We returned to the house at dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Evelyn set up her materials, candles, herbs, and ancient symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. She began to chant in a language I didn't understand, the words reverberating through the room. As the ritual progressed, the house seemed to come alive. The walls creaked and groaned, and a cold wind whipped through the halls. Suddenly, the dark figure from before appeared, its eyes glowing with rage. It lunged at us, but Evelyn stood her ground, continuing her chant with unwavering determination. The entity screamed, a sound that cut through me like a knife. Shadows swirled around us, and I felt an icy hand grip my shoulder. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I focused on Evelyn's steady voice. With a final, powerful incantation, Evelyn thrust a talisman into the entity's form. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figure dissipated into a cloud of smoke. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifted. Evelyn slumped to the floor, exhausted. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now." As we cleaned up, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. It was me, but not quite. The eyes were too dark, the smile too sharp. "You're not alone," it whispered, and the window shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The house felt different after the ritual, lighter somehow, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Evelyn stayed with me for a few days to ensure the entity didn't return. During that time, she taught me protective rituals and gave me a talisman for safety. Despite her reassurances, I still saw the dark reflection in every reflective surface. One night, I awoke to the sound of glass breaking. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound had come from the living room. I grabbed the talisman and made my way downstairs, every shadow seeming to move in the corner of my vision. The living room was a mess. The mirror pieces from the basement were scattered everywhere, despite having been locked away. My breath fogged in the cold air as I saw a dark figure standing among the shards. "Evelyn!" I shouted, hoping she would hear me. The figure turned, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You think you can get rid of me?" it hissed, its voice echoing with malice. Evelyn rushed in, clutching her own talisman. She began to chant, but this time the entity seemed prepared. It lashed out, sending her flying across the room. I ran to her side, but she was unconscious. The entity advanced, and I could feel its cold, dark energy pressing down on me. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The entity paused, its face twisting into a cruel smile. "I feed on fear and despair. Your uncle's obsession, your own fears, they give me strength. Desperation clawed at me as I looked around the room. I had to think of something. Evelyn's teachings flashed through my mind, and I remembered the box we had found with the journal. The twin mirror. I raced upstairs, feeling the entity's cold presence following me. In the study, I grabbed the ornate box and opened it. The small hand mirror inside was cracked but still intact. I ran back downstairs, the mirror in hand. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. "No! You cannot use that," it screamed. I remembered Evelyn's warning that the entity needed a vessel. I had to trap it again, but this time, I had to ensure it couldn't escape. With a deep breath, I held the mirror up. "By the power within this mirror, I bind you," I shouted, echoing Evelyn's incantations. The entity roared in defiance, but its form began to distort, drawn towards the mirror. The air crackled with energy as the dark figure was pulled, inch by inch, towards the reflective surface. The room seemed to implode as the entity was sucked into the mirror. A final, piercing scream filled the air, and then it was over. The mirror lay in my hands, whole and intact, its surface reflecting nothing but my own pale, terrified face. Evelyn stirred, groaning as she regained consciousness. "Did it work?" she asked weakly. I nodded, showing her the mirror. "It's trapped again." We spent the next few hours sealing the mirror with every protective charm and ritual Evelyn knew. Finally, we buried it deep in the woods, far from the house. As we covered it with earth, I felt a sense of finality. The entity was gone, but the scars it left would never fully heal. Evelyn stayed with me for a few more days until she was sure the house was clear. On her last day, she handed me a small, silver cross. "Keep this with you," she said. "It will protect you from any lingering spirits." Life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. But I couldn't help feeling a sense of unease every time I looked in a mirror. I avoided them as much as possible, but sometimes I would catch a glimpse of something dark and malevolent in my reflection. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I looked into the bathroom mirror. For a moment, everything seemed fine. But then, just as I was about to turn away, my reflection smiled at me. Its teeth were too sharp, its eyes too dark. "You're not alone," it whispered, and the mirror shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Story 7. The Faceless Presence. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes when I received a text from my husband, John. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." It wasn't unusual, his job often demanded late hours. I sighed, setting my phone on the counter, and looked out the window into the darkening evening. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. As I moved to the living room, I glanced at the security camera monitor out of habit. The screen showed our front yard, bathed in the dim light of the porch. My heart skipped a beat when I saw John walking up the driveway. Confusion clouded my mind. Had he sent the text before leaving work and forgotten to update me? But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a dark, faceless figure trailing behind him. I froze, my eyes glued to the screen. John reached the front door, and the faceless figure followed closely. The figure had no distinguishable features, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. Panic surged through me. Who or what was that thing with my husband? I rushed to the front door, heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I heard John's familiar footsteps, but they sounded strange, almost hollow. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if it wasn't really John on the other side? The thought made me shudder, but I had to know. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. John stood there, looking just like himself, but his eyes were vacant, empty. The dark figure was nowhere in sight. "John?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, just stared through me as if I wasn't there. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. His skin was cold, and he didn't react to my touch. Fear gripped me as I stepped back. "John, say something." He blinked slowly, and his gaze seemed to focus. "I'm home," he said in a flat, emotionless tone. It sent a chill down my spine. This was not my husband. I backed away, unsure of what to do. As I retreated, John stepped into the house, his movements stiff and unnatural. The front door slammed shut behind him without anyone touching it. My heart raced, and I stumbled over my words. What was that thing with you?" John tilted his head, a strange smile creeping across his face. "You saw it too?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "It's here for you, Emily." I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't let it out. The air around us seemed to thicken, and a cold breeze swept through the room. I had to find out what was happening, but the fear paralyzed me. I backed away further, keeping my eyes on John, or whatever he had become. "Why is it here?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. John's smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw the dark figure reflected in his eyes. "Because it wants something from us," he said. "And it won't leave until it gets what it wants." Hey, subscribe for more scary stories. The house felt colder than ever, and John's words echoed in my mind. The faceless figure had followed him inside, and now it wanted something from us. I could barely breathe as I backed away from him, trying to process what was happening. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and the silence felt oppressive. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What does it want?" John's vacant eyes locked onto mine. "It feeds on fear, Emily. It thrives on the terror it brings." His voice was detached, almost as if he was reciting a script rather than speaking from his own mind. I shivered, a chill running down my spine. The figure wanted to scare us, to feed off our fear. I glanced around the room, half expecting the faceless entity to materialize out of the shadows. "What can we do to stop it?" John's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of his old self shining through. "We need to find out what it is and why it's here. Until then, we must stay strong and not give in to fear." But the determination in his voice was fleeting, replaced by the same eerie calm. I nodded, though my mind was racing. There had to be something, some way to understand what was happening. I moved to the kitchen and grabbed my laptop, searching frantically for any information on faceless entities or supernatural occurrences. Every creak and whisper in the house made me jump, my nerves frayed to their breaking point. Hours passed, and the night grew darker. John sat motionless on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. My search yielded little more than vague legends and cryptic folklore. The faceless figure was an enigma, a nameless horror that defied explanation. As I read through another article, a sudden noise from upstairs made me jump. A loud thud followed by a dragging sound. I turned to John, but he remained unresponsive. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react, his eyes still fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown, the air growing colder with every step. The hallway was dark, the shadows seeming to dance and flicker in the dim light. The sound was coming from the guest room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded as I approached the door. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking ominously. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, letting in a cold breeze that made the curtains flutter like ghostly figures. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sense of dread was overwhelming. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, only the sound of my own breathing and the soft rustle of the curtains. Then I saw it, the faceless figure standing in the corner of the room, its presence a void that seemed to suck in all light. I froze, unable to move or scream. It stood motionless, as if waiting for me to make the first move. The air grew colder, and I felt a suffocating pressure around me. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed away until I hit the wall, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The The figure reached out, and I felt an icy grip on my arm. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm away, stumbling toward the door. I flung it open and ran downstairs, my heart racing. John was still on the couch, but now his head was turned toward me, a sinister smile on his face. "It's begun," he said softly, his voice echoing in the silent house. I was trembling as I reached the living room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. John's sinister smile sent a wave of nausea through me. The faceless figure had reached out, its cold grip still tingling on my arm. I needed answers, and fast. "John," I said, trying to steady my voice, "we need to do something. This thing is going to destroy us." His expression softened briefly, and I saw a glimmer of my husband behind those vacant eyes. "We have to stay strong, Emily. It's feeding off our fear. We can't let it win." But how could we stay strong when our own home had become a place of horror? I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, and the darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, threatening to engulf us. "There must be a way to fight it," I muttered, more to myself than to John. John's gaze shifted, and he seemed to be struggling with himself. "There is something," he said slowly. "I read about a ritual once. It might help us banish it." "A ritual?" It sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort, but we had no other options. "What do we need?" I asked, a mix of hope and desperation in my voice. He hesitated, then rattled off a list of items: candles, salt, a mirror, and a piece of paper with a specific symbol drawn on it. It all sounded so cliché, like something out of a movie, but I didn't care. If there was even a chance it could help, I was willing to try. We gathered the items quickly, the oppressive feeling in the house growing stronger with each passing minute. The darkness seemed to close in around us, and I felt the faceless figure's presence everywhere. We set up the ritual in the living room, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. John drew the symbol on the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "We need to speak the words together," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's an old language, but it should work if we focus." I nodded, taking a deep breath. As we began to chant, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to thicken. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting chaotic patterns of light and dark. I could feel the faceless figure's presence growing stronger, as if it knew what we were trying to do. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles went out, and an icy wind swept through the house. I grabbed John's hand, holding on for dear life. "Keep chanting," he urged, his voice rising above the howling wind. We continued, our voices trembling but determined. The darkness seemed to press in on us, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I bit back a scream, focusing on the words of the chant. The wind grew louder, almost deafening, and I could barely hear my own voice. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The darkness seemed to recede, and the candles flickered back to life. I opened my eyes and saw the faceless figure standing in the center of the room, its form shimmering and indistinct. It seemed to waver, as if struggling to maintain its presence. For a moment, I thought we had won. But then, the figure solidified, and a low, menacing laugh echoed through the room. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. "I am bound to this place, and now, so are you." John's grip on my hand tightened, and I felt his fear as acutely as my own. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't stay here." But as we turned to the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The faceless figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "This is only the beginning." Panic surged through me as the door slammed shut, trapping us inside with the malevolent entity. John's grip on my hand was the only thing grounding me in that moment of sheer terror. The faceless figure's whisper echoed in my mind, chilling me to the core. "This is only the beginning." "John," I whispered urgently, "we have to find another way out." He nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Let's try the back door," he said, pulling me towards the kitchen. As we moved, the house seemed to groan and shift around us, as if it were alive and complicit in our torment. Shadows flickered and danced along the walls, mocking our desperation. We reached the kitchen, and just as John reached for the back door, it too slammed shut with a deafening bang. I let out a scream, unable to contain my fear any longer. The faceless figure appeared in the doorway, blocking our escape, its form more solid and menacing than ever. "You cannot run from me," it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. "I am everywhere." Desperation turned into defiance. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling but strong. "What do you want from us?" The figure's faceless head seemed to tilt, as if considering my question. "You trespassed in my domain," it said slowly. "This house is my prison, and now, it is yours as well." John squeezed my hand, drawing my attention. "Emily," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Before we moved here, I found an old diary in the attic. It belonged to the previous owner, a woman named Margaret. She wrote about a dark presence, a spirit that haunted this place. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal. "I thought it was just stories," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to scare you. But now I realize, we should have never ignored the warnings." The faceless figure moved closer, its form shifting and flowing like smoke. "She summoned me," it said, its voice cold and empty. "She tried to bind me here, but she failed. Now you must suffer the consequences." I felt a surge of determination. "No," I said firmly. "We won't let you trap us here. There must be a way to break the curse." John nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. Margaret's diary mentioned a final ritual, one she never completed. If we can find it, we might have a chance. We raced upstairs, the faceless figure trailing us with an almost lazy confidence, as if it knew we couldn't escape. In the attic, we found the diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Flipping through the entries, we found the ritual, a complex series of incantations and symbols, far more intricate than the one we had tried before. "Let's do this," John said, his voice steady. We gathered the necessary items and set up the ritual circle in the attic. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the faceless figure's presence looming behind us. As we began the chant, the figure let out a shriek of rage, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive, clawing at us. We held hands, focusing on the incantation, our voices rising above the chaos. The figure's screams grew louder, a cacophony of anger and despair. The shadows swirled faster, obscuring everything. Just as I thought we would be consumed by the darkness, there was a blinding flash of light. The shadows recoiled, and the faceless figure let out one final, agonized scream before dissipating into nothingness. Silence fell over the attic. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. Did we do it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, pulling me into his arms. "I think we did. It's over." But as we caught our breath, the house creaked ominously. The temperature plummeted once more, and a familiar, sinister whisper filled the air. "You cannot escape. I am bound to this place, and now, so are you." We looked at each other in horror as the realization dawned. The ritual hadn't banished the entity, it had merely transferred the curse. The faceless figure was gone, but its malevolent presence lingered, now bound to us. We were trapped, prisoners of the house and its eternal darkness. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.